At the beginning of the 9th century, the Bulgars were on the brink of a humiliating and catastrophic defeat. With a massive Byzantine army marauding across their territory unchecked, it seemed as though this warrior tribe who for centuries had struck fear into the hearts of mighty Eastern Roman emperors were about to be relegated to the pages of history, as even their capital city was captured and plundered by the enemy. The now euphoric Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros was on the cusp of his greatest victory, his lost lands finally reclaimed, his most dangerous rival permanently subdued. However, just days later his entire army would be destroyed, his very skull fashioned into the victorious Bulgar Khan's personal drinking cup, in a final humiliation by a man who would bring about the downfall of not just one, but 3 Byzantine emperors in 3 years. But how did this relatively unknown historical leader oversee such a dramatic reversal of fortunes? The Bulgars were steppe nomads who migrated away from their ancestral homelands near the Caspian Sea in search of a new life further west, settling in the Balkans at some time in the 5th century in an area they had seized from the declining Eastern Roman Empire, an empire now generally referred to as the Byzantine Empire. Settling right on the doorstep of one of the most powerful empires on earth inevitably resulted in the Bulgars being forced to wage a near constant war for survival against their much larger and more powerful neighbours, as ambitious Byzantine emperors attempted to seize back their lost territories and restore the empire to something near its former glory. Over the centuries that followed, relations between the two sides fluctuated wildly, the sometimes bitter rivals waging a series of sporadic wars interspersed with periods of peace that occasionally saw both sides ally against a common enemy, the opportunistic Bulgars happy to take Byzantine gold whenever Constantinople was threatened by a more troubling foe. However, this uneasy coexistence would once again give way to all-out war with the rise to power of a new Bulgarian Khan at the turn of the 9th century. Known as Krum the Fearsome, the new leader of the Bulgars initially preferred to avoid risky wars of attrition with the Byzantines that he knew would heavily deplete his forces for meager gains in territory, instead focusing his expansion efforts in the west with impressive results, the Khan managing to double Bulgar territory in just a decade, his new kingdom spreading all the way to the borders of the Frankish Empire. The Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros ascended to the throne at roughly the same time as his Bulgar rival, and watched on in fear from Constantinople as the old enemy swelled in size, power, and wealth under the leadership of a competent yet highly aggressive Khan. Emperor Nikephoros became convinced that he had to act decisively against the Bulgars before it was too late. He could no longer tolerate a rising empire of pagans on his doorstep that might one day eclipse the might of Byzantium herself. In 807, he led an army against the Bulgar Khan, hoping to retake territory that had been lost in previous wars. However, before any meaningful progress could be made, Nikephoros was forced to abandon the campaign and return home to deal with a plot against him in Constantinople. However, this aggressive action would ignite a series of events that would ultimately lead to his humiliating doom. In response to this Byzantine aggression, the Bulgar army renewed raids into the empire's heartlands, culminating in Khan Krum's capture and destruction of modern-day Sofia, the vengeful Bulgars slaughtering the city's garrison of 6,000 despite a guarantee of safe passage. With Sofia in enemy hands, the main routes into Constantinople itself were now unguarded, leaving Emperor Nikephoros with little choice other than to immediately move against the invaders, personally leading an unprepared and hastily gathered army against the Khan who was fast becoming his nemesis. Yet once again, the emperor's lofty ambitions were quickly thwarted, as growing discontent amongst the troops almost resulted in him losing control of the entire army, the disobedience spreading through the ranks, forcing him to again return home to stave off an outright mutiny. Shaken by the sheer aggression and boldness of Khan Krum's invasion, and now realizing just how tenuous his grip on the Byzantine army was, Emperor Nikephoros focused all of his efforts on readying his forces for a final war that he hoped would humble the Bulgars once and for all, dedicating the entire following year to intense and near-obsessive preparations, imposing new taxes to fund the coming campaign, and even requiring every village in the empire to provide one fully equipped soldier to bolster his army. By 811, his preparations for the long-planned war were finally complete, and he set off on what he was sure would be the crowning achievement of his reign. The hated Bulgars would finally be brought to heel, this irritating thorn in his side finally removed. With such a large and well-supplied force at their disposal, the Byzantines expected an easy conquest, and the opening stages of the campaign appeared to support this initial confidence, as Nikephoros led his 22,000 men deep into Bulgarian territory relatively unopposed, a cautious Khan Krum choosing to withdraw his forces in the face of the enemy, realizing that he could not overcome them in open battle. The Bulgar Khan attempted to sue for peace, hoping to end the conflict before any blood was shed. However, a now impetuous Emperor Nikephoros interpreted this as confirmation of his foe's weakness, and rebuffed all diplomatic olive branches, now certain that a glorious and total victory was within his grasp. As the Byzantines approached the Bulgar capital of Pliska, the Khan was forced to finally take the field. However, the ensuing clash appears to have been an easy victory for the Byzantines, with the hastily assembled Bulgar defense force either outright destroyed or strategically withdrawn, the Khan forced to abandon his capital to the enemy. The victorious Byzantines promptly sacked the city, looting anything they could carry away, and even Emperor Nikephoros is said to have partaken in the plundering, raiding Khan Krum's personal treasure stash and sharing his precious wine collection with his men, a final humiliation that no doubt reached the ear of the Khan and added to the growing animosity he felt towards his invading rival. Nevertheless, Khan Krum once again offered a truce, telling the emperor to take what he wanted and leave in peace. But Nikephoros had now become blindly euphoric in his overconfidence, convinced that all of Bulgaria could be conquered. Such hubris was understandable. The Bulgarian army had been forced to flee, and the capital had fallen. It appeared as though the emperor had finally vanquished his old enemy and restored his empire's ancient borders along the Danube. However, Khan Krum was far from beaten. Drunk on his apparent success, Emperor Nikephoros retired to his tent and allowed discipline amongst his victorious troops to break down, the men rampaging across the countryside unchecked as they looted, burned, and carried out horrific reprisals against Bulgar civilians, the savagery so extreme that the disciplined army that had earlier crossed the border now more closely resembled a chaotic mob of bandits. In a show of steely restraint, Khan Krum gathered his remaining men into one cohesive force while his kingdom burned, putting the troops to work setting traps and blocking the narrow mountain trails that the Byzantines would need to pass through on their way back to Constantinople, during the turbulent time that they were preoccupied with plundering and ravaging his lands. The Khan knew that his best chance at defeating the Byzantine invaders lay in utilizing the Bulgars' favored tactics of surprise and ambush. If he could take possession of the high ground and trap the Byzantine army in a narrow mountain pass, he could almost certainly destroy them. With his carefully planned ambush prepared, the Khan and his army patiently waited, watching from the shadows for the right moment to fall upon their foe. Emperor Nikephoros had initially planned to next attack and recapture the city of Sofia. However, he appears to have been alerted to the fact that Khan Krum and his army were on the move, and instead made the fateful decision to return home directly along the shortest route to Constantinople, the exact route along which the Bulgars had set their trap. To make matters worse, the overconfident Byzantine emperor neglected to scout ahead, and by the time he realized that the path ahead had been blocked with thick wooden fortifications, the Bulgars had already sealed off the valley entrance, trapping the entire Byzantine army on the low ground, while the Khan's troops gleefully watched on from the surrounding heights. With no possibility of retreat, the emperor seems to have fallen into despair, reacting to the disastrous strategic situation he was in by simply ordering his men to set up camp and wait, despite his generals pleading with him to take the initiative and at least try to break out of the net of bloodthirsty Bulgar warriors that now enveloped them. For 3 days, the Bulgars taunted their cornered prey, banging their shields and yelling threats at the terrified Byzantine soldiers below, eventually falling upon them like a torrent of death at dawn on the 4th day, when their morale was at its lowest, cutting off the head of the army by destroying Nikephoros' encampment first, wiping out the elite imperial bodyguard as they desperately fought to protect their emperor. After seeing the imperial encampment so easily overrun, the rest of the Byzantine army gave up all hope and fled for their lives in panic. However, this chaotic rout merely sealed the army's fate, for there could now be no escape. Thousands are said to have died attempting to cross the nearby river, either cut down by the pursuing Bulgarians or drowning under the weight of their own armour and weapons, the men sinking into the smothering mud along the riverfront or slipping beneath the surface as men trampled one another in a desperate but futile attempt to flee. The few who made it across the river would find no sanctuary on the other side, the imposing wooden walls and fortifications blocking the way, impossible for all but the strongest to surmount, with many who attempted the climb falling into deep ditches dug on the other side of the walls, the steep drop either killing them outright or breaking their limbs and immobilizing them. In this slaughter that would later be named the Battle of Pliska, most of the Byzantine army of up to 60,000 men was wiped out, along with all of the officers and even the emperor himself, with the emperor's son and heir carried to safety by a small number of survivors, despite suffering a wound to his neck which left him permanently paralyzed. For Khan Krum the Fearsome, the battle was a victory that surpassed even his wildest dreams. His nemesis lay dead on the field, his son and heir gravely wounded, the invading army was destroyed, and the Byzantine military elite was decimated. However, the Khan's burning anger at the man who had wrought so much destruction upon his homeland was yet to be dampened. In a final act of humiliation, he ordered the desecration of the fallen emperor's corpse, instructing his men to cut off Nikephoros' head, boil away the flesh, and line the skull with silver, transforming the skull of his hated rival into an ornately decorated cup, which he is said to have drank from to toast his great victory over the Byzantine Empire. Yet drinking from the skull of a fallen enemy was not merely an act of dominance for the victorious Khan. Many steppe cultures, including the Bulgars, believed that drinking from a defeated enemy's skull consumed his very essence, transferring the immense power held within the soul of the vanquished into the victor. The more skulls taken and souls consumed, the more powerful a warlord could become. In fact, the practice of drinking from the skull of a slain enemy was surprisingly widespread throughout history, with the oldest skull cup dated at sometime around 12,750 BC. Other notable examples include the Japanese warlord Oda Nobunaga, who took the skulls of 3 fallen rivals following a victory in battle to use as sake cups to inspire fear in other potential enemies, while the skull of Sviatoslav I of Kiev was made into a chalice by his enemy Khan Kuria in 972 AD, not to humiliate the fallen leader, but as an act of respect, later drinking from the skull with his wife, while praying to be blessed with a son as brave and mighty a warrior as his slain enemy. Bolstered by his overwhelming victory, Khan Krum would invade the greatly weakened Byzantine Empire the following year, seizing several fortresses and even laying siege to Constantinople itself, the Khan's successors forcing the son of the dead emperor Nikephoros, the paralyzed new emperor Starakios, to abdicate before he joined his father in the afterlife, quickly succumbing to the terrible wounds he had received at the disastrous Battle of Pliska. His successor and brother-in-law, Emperor Michael I, would face a similarly short reign, and had to abdicate and become a monk after being routed in battle by the invading Bulgars, becoming the 3rd Byzantine emperor to fall at the hands of Khan Krum in just 3 years. Khan Krum would besiege Constantinople for a second time in 814 AD, but would die from what is suspected to have been a cerebral hemorrhage at the height of the siege, entrusting the Bulgar Empire to his less aggressive son, who quickly made peace with the Byzantines and returned home. What became of Emperor Nikephoros' skull cup is unknown. However, the legacy of the Battle of Pliska would have far-reaching consequences, the catastrophic defeat deterring future Byzantine rulers from entering Bulgar territory for the next century and a half, allowing the Bulgars time to grow in size and strength, becoming an empire in their own right. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.